They missed my Nobel Prize nomination because it would overshadow my sister's inevitable breakthrough. Now she's lost her research position while I'm changing the world. Growing up, our house felt like a shrine to my sister's intelligence. Every report card she brought home was celebrated like a national holiday, while mine were met with polite nods and comments about how I was doing just fine. The living room walls were covered with her science fair ribbons, academic achievement certificates, and newspaper clippings from local competitions. My own accomplishments found their way to the refrigerator, buried under grocery lists and appointment reminders. My parents had this way of introducing us that made my stomach turn every single time. At family gatherings, neighborhood barbecues, or chance encounters at the grocery store, it was always the same script. They beamed with pride as they talked about their little Einstein and how she was destined for greatness, how the Nobel Committee would probably need to create a special category just for her revolutionary work. Then they'd remember I was standing there too and add something like, "And this one's doing well in her studies too," with the kind of smile you give a participation trophy. The chemistry lab became my sanctuary during college. While everyone else was out partying or stressing about social media drama, I found peace in the precise measurements, the predictable reactions, the way elements behaved exactly as they should when you understood their nature. My research focused on cellular interactions that everyone else found boring, but I saw patterns that fascinated me. Late nights in the lab felt like meditation, watching compounds transform under carefully controlled conditions. Meanwhile, my sister was making waves in graduate school, publishing papers that got attention from professors who called her work revolutionary and paradigm-shifting. My parents would forward me every article mentioned, every conference invitation she received, every award announcement. They'd call me at all hours to share the latest news about her career trajectory, always ending with reminders about how proud they were to have such a brilliant daughter who would surely change the world. When I started my own graduate program, focusing on cancer cell research, my parents' reactions were distinctly different. They attended my thesis defense but spent the entire reception talking about my sister's latest publication. They'd nod politely when I explained my research discoveries, but their eyes would glaze over in a way that made it clear they were just waiting for their turn to share updates about the real scientist in the family. The breakthrough came during my third year of postdoc research. I'd been working on understanding how certain compounds could disrupt cancer cell division without harming healthy tissue. The work was methodical, unglamorous, involving thousands of tiny adjustments and failed experiments. But something clicked during one particularly long night in the lab. The cellular responses I was seeing didn't match anything in the existing literature, and suddenly I realized I might be looking at something entirely new. The next 6 months were a blur of verification experiments, peer reviews, and cautious optimism. My research advisor kept telling me not to get too excited, that groundbreaking discoveries were rare and usually turned out to be measurement errors or contaminated samples. But every test confirmed what I was seeing. I had stumbled onto a mechanism that could potentially revolutionize cancer treatment. When the award nomination came through, I called my parents immediately. My hands were shaking as I dialed their number, imagining how proud they'd finally be. The recognition was significant, not just some participation certificate, but a legitimate acknowledgement from the international scientific community. For the first time in my life, I thought I might get the kind of celebration my sister had always received. Their response crushed me in ways I hadn't expected. After a long pause, my mother's voice came through the phone with a tone I'd never heard before. She said they needed to think about the timing, about how this might affect my sister's career trajectory. My father took the phone and explained that my sister was at a critical juncture in her research, that any media attention around our family's scientific achievements should focus on her work since it was more likely to have lasting impact. They suggested I consider declining the nomination or at least postponing the ceremony until after my sister's next major publication. When I refused, explaining that you don't just postpone international scientific recognition, they made their decision. They wouldn't attend the ceremony because it would send the wrong message about which daughter's work they considered more important. I sat in my car outside their house for 20 minutes after that conversation, trying to process what had just happened. The people who should have been my biggest supporters had just told me that my achievement was inconvenient to their narrative about which daughter was supposed to be the success story. The awards ceremony was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. My research advisor attended, along with several colleagues who understood the significance of the recognition. I gave my acceptance speech to a room full of respected scientists who genuinely appreciated the work I'd been doing. But the empty seats where my family should have been sitting felt like a physical weight in my chest. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped calling home with updates about my research. I stopped forwarding them articles that mentioned my work. I stopped trying to earn recognition that they seemed determined not to give. Instead, I threw myself completely into the clinical trial process, working with medical teams to translate my laboratory discoveries into actual treatments for real patients. Update 1. The past year has been the most professionally rewarding and personally devastating period of my life. My research has moved into phase 2 clinical trials, and the preliminary results are beyond anything I dared hope for. Patients who had exhausted all other treatment options are showing significant improvement. Medical journals are calling it a potential breakthrough in cancer therapy. International research teams are reaching out for collaboration opportunities. But the thing that's been eating at me is what happened to my sister. About 8 months ago, I started hearing whispers through the academic community. Her name was coming up in conversations, but not in the way our parents had always predicted. Colleagues would mention her with this uncomfortable tone, the way people discuss someone who's made a serious professional mistake. I tried to ignore the rumors at first. Despite everything, she was still my sister, and I didn't want to believe she was in trouble. But the whispers kept getting louder, and eventually, someone I trusted pulled me aside at a conference to tell me what was happening. Her research was being investigated. Several of her published papers contained data that couldn't be replicated by other teams. The inconsistencies were too significant to be explained by normal experimental variation. Independent researchers who had tried to build on her work found themselves unable to reproduce her key findings, which led to closer scrutiny of her original data. The investigation revealed systematic data manipulation spanning 3 years of her research. Results had been altered to support predetermined conclusions. Control groups had been cherry-picked to make experimental effects appear more dramatic. Statistical analyses had been performed multiple times until the desired significance levels were achieved, then the failed attempts were deleted from lab records. What made it worse was discovering that the pressure she felt to produce groundbreaking results had been building for years. Our parents had been so vocal about her inevitable Nobel Prize that colleagues at her university knew about their expectations. They'd introduced her at faculty mixers as their future Nobel laureate daughter, creating an impossible standard that she felt obligated to meet. The night before her research position was terminated, she called me for the first time in over a year. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she tried to explain what had happened. She talked about the weight of everyone's expectations, about how every experiment that produced normal, inconclusive results felt like a personal failure. She'd started with small adjustments to data, telling herself it was just cleaning up messy results that didn't reflect the true underlying patterns she was convinced existed. But the small adjustments became bigger ones, and eventually she was fabricating entire data sets to support theories that sounded revolutionary but weren't based in actual experimental evidence. She'd been living in constant fear of discovery, spending more time covering her tracks than doing legitimate research. Listening to her breakdown over the phone, I felt a complicated mix of anger and heartbreak. I was furious about the career she'd destroyed through her choices, about the damage she'd done to scientific integrity, about the way her actions would reflect on our entire family's reputation in the academic community. But I also felt devastated for the person she could have been if she'd been allowed to pursue genuine scientific discovery without the crushing weight of our parents' impossible expectations. Our parents' reaction to her career collapse was almost as painful to watch as her original downfall. They went through stages of denial, anger, and desperate attempts to find someone else to blame. They contacted lawyers about potential wrongful termination claims. They reached out to colleagues trying to find alternative explanations for the data inconsistencies. They even suggested that jealous competitors might have sabotaged her research to prevent her from achieving the recognition she deserved. But eventually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Journal retractions started appearing, each one like another nail in the coffin of their dreams about raising a scientific prodigy. The local newspaper that had once featured articles about their brilliant daughter now ran a story about research fraud at the state university. Friends and neighbors who had heard years of bragging about her inevitable Nobel Prize were now seeing headlines about falsified data and academic misconduct. Update 2. The past 6 months have brought changes I never could have anticipated. My clinical trials have exceeded every expectation, with results so promising that pharmaceutical companies are competing to license my research for commercial development. The treatment protocol I developed is being fast-tracked through regulatory approval because of its potential to help thousands of patients who currently have limited options. More importantly, patients who participated in the trials have been reaching out to share their stories. A woman who'd been given 6 months to live is now in complete remission after 18 months of treatment. A man who'd undergone multiple unsuccessful surgeries is back to playing with his grandchildren. These personal stories matter more to me than any professional recognition ever could. But the situation with my family has become even more complicated. About 3 months ago, my parents showed up at my laboratory unannounced. They'd driven 4 hours without calling ahead, apparently hoping to catch me during a moment when I might be more receptive to reconciliation. Seeing them standing in the hallway outside my lab felt surreal. They looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. My mother was carrying a folder full of newspaper clippings about my clinical trial results. My father had printed out articles from medical journals that mentioned my research. They wanted to talk about how proud they were of my accomplishments, how they'd always known I had the potential for great things, how they'd been following my career progress with intense interest. They brought up memories of my childhood curiosity about science, claiming they'd always supported my intellectual pursuits. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. I listened as they tried to rewrite history, painting themselves as supportive parents who had equally encouraged both daughters' scientific interests. They talked about my sister's situation as a tragic misunderstanding, suggesting that the academic system had failed her rather than acknowledging her deliberate choices to falsify data. What struck me most was their complete inability to understand how their behavior had contributed to the family's current situation. They seemed genuinely confused about why I might be hurt by their absence from my award ceremony. They couldn't grasp the connection between their years of comparative parenting and my sister's eventual desperation to produce results that would live up to their impossible expectations. I found myself explaining things I'd never put into words before. How their constant comparisons had affected my self-esteem throughout childhood and adolescence. How their absence from my award ceremony had felt like a final confirmation that my achievements would never matter as much as hers. How their public bragging about her inevitable Nobel Prize had created pressure that no real human being could sustainably handle. They listened with expressions that shifted between defensiveness and something that might have been recognition. My mother started crying when I described how isolated I'd felt during my own breakthrough discoveries, how I'd learned not to share good news because it was always overshadowed by updates about my sister's supposedly more important work. The most heartbreaking moment came when my father admitted that they'd been so invested in the idea of having a prodigy daughter that they'd stopped seeing either of us as real people with our own individual paths and challenges. He acknowledged that their dreams about Nobel Prizes and scientific fame had been more about their own pride than about our actual happiness or fulfillment. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that I'm still processing. During that conversation, my mother revealed something that completely changed my understanding of our family dynamics. She told me that my sister had been struggling with anxiety and depression since graduate school, symptoms that had been getting progressively worse as the pressure to produce groundbreaking results intensified. Apparently, my sister had been calling them regularly during the months leading up to her research falsification, expressing doubts about her abilities and fears that she wasn't living up to their expectations. Instead of encouraging her to seek support or reassuring her that their love wasn't conditional on professional achievement, they doubled down on their confidence in her eventual success. They told her that all great scientists face periods of doubt, that her feelings of inadequacy were just proof that she was pushing herself hard enough to achieve something truly revolutionary. They'd shared stories about famous Nobel laureates who had faced similar challenges before their breakthrough discoveries, essentially encouraging her to push through her mental health struggles rather than addressing them directly. Learning this information was devastating because it revealed how completely our parents had misunderstood what both of their daughters actually needed from them. While I had been starving for recognition and support, my sister had been drowning under expectations that she desperately wanted to escape but didn't know how to voice. The most shocking revelation came near the end of our conversation. My father told me that they'd received calls from colleagues and friends asking about my clinical trial results, wanting to know more about the daughter who was developing revolutionary cancer treatments. For the first time in their lives, people were more interested in hearing about my work than my sister's academic achievements. He admitted that they'd been uncomfortable with this reversal of attention, that they hadn't known how to talk about my success because it didn't fit the narrative they'd been telling about their family for so many years. They'd been so invested in my sister being the scientific genius that they literally didn't have language for discussing my actual accomplishments. Final update. The past year has brought a resolution I never could have imagined, though it's been more complicated and emotionally exhausting than any Hollywood ending could capture. My treatment protocol received full regulatory approval last month, and the first commercial doses are being distributed to cancer centers across the country. Patients who had no other options now have access to a therapy that came directly from those long nights I spent in the laboratory, trying to understand cellular interactions that everyone else found boring. But the personal healing has been much more gradual and painful than the professional triumph. My sister and I started talking regularly about 6 months ago, initially just brief phone calls to check on each other's well-being. Those conversations gradually became longer and more honest as we both started processing the childhood we'd shared from our different perspectives. She told me things I'd never known about her experience growing up as the designated family genius. How the constant praise and expectations had made her feel like she was performing a role rather than living her own life. How every academic achievement felt hollow because it was expected rather than celebrated as a pleasant surprise. How she'd started to believe that her worth as a person was entirely dependent on producing revolutionary scientific discoveries. The pressure had been so intense that she'd stopped enjoying research itself, viewing every experiment only in terms of whether it would bring her closer to the Nobel Prize our parents had promised she would win. She'd lost the curiosity and wonder that had originally drawn her to science, replacing those feelings with anxiety about whether her work was groundbreaking enough to justify everyone's expectations. Hearing her perspective helped me understand that we'd both been victims of our parents' need to have a prodigy child, just in different ways. While I'd been starved of recognition and encouragement, she'd been overwhelmed by impossible standards and conditional love that depended on constant achievement. Our parents have been trying to rebuild relationships with both of us, but the process has been awkward and sometimes frustrating. They've started attending therapy to work on their parenting patterns, which has led to some genuine insights about how their own childhood experiences shaped their approach to raising us. My mother grew up in a family where academic achievement was the only form of success that received recognition. My father had always felt like an underachiever compared to his siblings, and he'd been determined to raise children who would exceed every expectation. Their dreams about having a Nobel laureate daughter had been more about healing their own childhood wounds than about supporting our individual development. They've apologized repeatedly for missing my awards ceremony, acknowledging that their decision sent a devastating message about whose achievements they valued. They've also expressed regret about the pressure they put on my sister, recognizing that their public bragging about her inevitable Nobel Prize had created an impossible situation for her to navigate. But apologies can only repair so much damage. The years of comparative parenting, the missed celebrations of my achievements, the crushing expectations placed on my sister's shoulders. These experiences shaped who we became as adults in ways that can't be easily undone through conversations and therapy sessions. My sister has been working on rebuilding her career, starting with research positions that focus on replication studies and data verification rather than groundbreaking discoveries. She's finding satisfaction in the careful, methodical work of confirming other people's findings, describing it as a form of redemption for the falsification that destroyed her previous career path. She's also been speaking at conferences about research integrity and the pressure young scientists face to produce revolutionary results. Her presentations are powerful because she speaks from personal experience about how the competitive academic environment can lead researchers to make devastating ethical compromises. The relationship between my parents and both of their daughters is slowly improving, but it's built on a completely different foundation now. Instead of discussing our professional achievements, we talk about our personal well-being, our individual interests outside of work, our hopes for relationships and experiences that have nothing to do with scientific recognition. My clinical trial results continue to exceed expectations, with new applications for the treatment being discovered regularly. But the most meaningful part of this work isn't the professional recognition or the potential financial benefits from licensing deals. It's the letters I receive from patients and their families, sharing stories about how the treatment has given them time they thought they'd lost, opportunities to create memories they'd never expected to have. One patient wrote to tell me about walking her daughter down the aisle at a wedding she'd thought she'd never live to see. Another sent photos from his grandson's first birthday party, an event he'd been told he wouldn't survive to attend. These personal stories remind me why I fell in love with research in the first place, back when I was spending long nights in the laboratory trying to understand how cells behave under different conditions. The irony isn't lost on me that my competent but not groundbreaking research has ended up having more real-world impact than my sister's supposedly revolutionary work ever could have. But I've stopped thinking about our careers in competitive terms. We're both scientists who found different paths through the complex world of research and discovery, shaped by family dynamics that neither of us chose but both of us had to overcome. The Nobel Prize my parents always assumed my sister would win remains unclaimed by either daughter. But I've learned that the most meaningful recognition comes from knowing that your work makes a difference in real people's lives, not from prestigious awards or academic accolades. My sister and I have talked about this, about how our parents' obsession with external validation distracted all of us from the intrinsic satisfaction that comes from good work done with integrity and care. We've both found peace in career paths that prioritize substance over recognition, impact over prestige. The family narrative that dominated our childhood, the story about the genius daughter who would inevitably win Nobel Prizes and change the world, has finally been replaced by something more honest and sustainable. We're two women who love science for different reasons, who've made different choices about how to contribute to human knowledge, who've learned to measure success by our own standards rather than by our parents' impossible expectations. The awards and recognition I've received for my cancer research feel meaningful now because they represent acknowledgement of work I chose to pursue for my own reasons, not because I was trying to fulfill someone else's dreams about what my life should accomplish. And my sister has found her own form of professional satisfaction in research that prioritizes accuracy and integrity over groundbreaking discoveries. We'll never get back the childhood years we spent competing for parental approval or the early career decisions we made based on family expectations rather than personal interests. But we've both learned to build adult lives that reflect our own values and priorities, careers that satisfy our individual curiosity and desire to contribute to something larger than ourselves. The family that boycotted my awards ceremony because it might overshadow my sister's inevitable breakthrough has been replaced by a family that celebrates smaller, more genuine achievements. My parents have learned to express pride in both daughters' work without making comparisons or predictions about future recognition. My sister and I have developed a relationship based on mutual support rather than competitive comparison. And somewhere in a cancer treatment center, a patient is receiving a therapy that came from all those nights I spent alone in a laboratory, trying to understand cellular interactions that fascinated me even when no one else thought they were important. That's the recognition that matters most. The proof that competent work done with care and persistence can change lives in ways that prestigious awards never could.